5 salaries, 1 apartment, and 5 different answers to the same question. Can I afford the rent? The listed rent is $1,900. The applicant earning $40,000 is screened out. At $60,000, the search probably needs a cheaper unit or roommate. At $80,000, the application may pass. But passing the landlord's test still does not prove the rent is comfortable. That matters in 2026 because Zillow placed the typical U.S. asking rent at about $1,895 in February. Zillow estimated a household needed roughly $76,000 a year to afford it under the traditional 30% convention. Yet census data show 49.7% of renter households were already spending more than 30% of income on housing. So we will calculate 3 different numbers at $40,000, $60,000, $80,000, $100,000, $120,000 a year. The rent a landlord may approve, the housing cost a rule of thumb permits, and the rent your cash flow can actually support. Each case uses a single filer, the 2026 standard deduction, federal income tax, and employee Social Security and Medicare tax. State tax, benefits, and retirement deductions vary, so these are comparisons, not paycheck promises. First, fix the most common mistake in the 30% rule. Housing is not only the number printed on the lease. HUD affordability measures use gross rent, contract rent plus tenant-paid utilities. If 30% of salary produces a $1,000 housing ceiling and utilities cost $180, the contract rent ceiling is closer to $820. Forget utilities and you cross the line before groceries or commuting enter the picture. Now meet the landlord's version. Many property managers seek gross monthly income around 3 times monthly rent. That suggests approval ceilings near $1,111 at $40,000, $1,667 at $60,000, $2,222 at $80,000, $2,778 at $100,000, and $3,333 at $120,000. Those numbers describe qualification, not safety. The screen cannot see your full life. It may not know about childcare, expensive debt, a required car, family support, or an empty emergency fund. 2 renters with the same salary can receive the same approval and carry completely different risk. Approval asks whether a property manager can accept the application. Affordability asks whether the renter can keep paying while still living and saving. At $40,000, estimated 2026 federal income tax is about $2,620. Employee Social Security and Medicare add about $3,060. That leaves roughly $2,860 per month before state tax, benefits, and retirement deductions. 30% of $40,000 allows $1,000 for rent plus utilities. Reserve $180 for utilities, and the worked example contract rent ceiling becomes about $820. A 3 times income screen might approve around $1,111 of rent, but that rent plus utilities would consume roughly 45% of this federal-only monthly take-home estimate. Approval and breathing room are already far apart. At $60,000, estimated federal tax is about $5,020 and FICA is $4,590. Monthly pay after those 2 deductions is about $4,199. The 30% housing ceiling is $1,500. After a $200 utility reserve, contract rent is roughly $1,300. Compare that with the typical asking rent of $1,895. Add assumed utilities and housing becomes about $2,095. Almost half of the federal-only monthly take-home estimate at $60,000. The salaries sound solid, but the typical national rent does not fit cleanly without a cheaper market, concession, roommate, or sacrifice elsewhere. At $80,000, federal tax is about $8,770 and FICA is $6,120. That leaves approximately $5,426 per month before state tax and benefits. 30% of gross income allows $2,000 for total housing. After a $220 utility reserve, the rent ceiling is about $1,780. This is the turning point. The $80,000 renter can likely satisfy a common 3 times income screen for the typical U.S. rent. But typical rent plus assumed utilities totals about $2,115, slightly above the traditional housing ceiling. Qualification says yes. The 30% convention says just over the line. The complete budget decides whether that gap is harmless or monthly stress. At $100,000, estimated federal tax is $13,170 and FICA is $7,650. Monthly pay after those deductions is about $6,598. The gross housing ceiling is $2,500. After a $240 utility reserve, contract rent is roughly $2,260. The typical national rent fits. Location can erase that comfort. Zillow's February report placed typical rent in the New York metro above $3,200. A 6-figure salary that looks generous nationally can still become housing-burdened in an expensive market. Salary only makes sense relative to local housing and the rest of the household budget. At $120,000, federal tax is about $17,570 and FICA is $9,180. Monthly pay after those deductions is about $7,771. The gross housing ceiling is $3,000. After a $260 utility reserve, the illustrative rent ceiling is about $2,740. That provides room, but does not make every $3,300 landlord approval comfortable. Add utilities, and the approved unit could absorb nearly 46% of this federal-only take-home estimate. State tax, insurance, retirement contributions, debt, or family costs close the gap quickly. Higher income raises the ceiling. It does not repeal arithmetic. Use a 4-gate test. Gate 1 is qualification. Confirm the property's income, credit, deposit, and documentation rules. Gate 2 is housing burden. Combine rent and tenant-paid utilities. Gate 3 is real cash flow. Start with deposited pay, then subtract debt minimums, transportation, insurance, food, childcare, and other non-negotiables. Gate 4 is resilience. Preserve savings and room for one bad month. The practical formula is deposited pay minus non-housing essentials, minus savings you refuse to skip, minus estimated utilities, minus a monthly safety margin. What remains is the maximum contract rent your current life can support. Compare it with the 30% ceiling and the landlord screen. The safest search ceiling is the lowest of the three, not the highest. Remember move-in costs, a security deposit, application fees, utility setup, moving expenses, and basic furniture. Zillow reported nearly 40% of rental listings offered a concession in February 2026. A free month can lower first-year effective rent. It does not permanently lower the lease. Now place the 5 salaries side by side. 30% total housing ceilings are $1,000, $1,500, $2,000, $2,500, and $3,000. After our clearly labeled utility reserves, illustrative contract rent ceilings become about $820, $1,300, $1,780, $2,260, and $2,740. These are comparison points, not universal recommendations. Your ceiling moves down with state tax, large payroll deductions, debt dependence, or unstable income. It may move up when a partner reliably shares costs, utilities are included, transportation is cheap, and emergency savings are strong. The lesson is simple. Do not shop from the maximum number a listing site or property manager gives you. Calculate qualification rent, 30% gross housing, and cash flow rent. Put utilities beside the lease price. Then search below the lowest ceiling. A landlord can approve the lease. Only your complete cash flow can tell you whether the key feels like freedom or a monthly trap.